Close your eyes for a second. Imagine the oldest place you can. Maybe you think of Egypt, pyramids, stone temples. Now erase all of that. We are thousands of years before recorded history, before the pharaohs, before any alphabet, before the great kingdoms that fill our history books. Open your eyes and place yourself on an arid plain, near a spring in the middle of the desert. In front of you, something impossible for that time. A stone wall about 4 meters high, surrounding a cluster of houses, and, beside it, a massive tower rising up into the sky. This place should not exist here, nor now, but it does. You are in ancient Jericho, around 8000 BC, facing one of the greatest historical paradoxes of our timeline of civilization. Welcome, explorer. In this episode, we are going to explore together some civilizations that seem to have emerged way too early. 6 ancient civilizations that existed before official history began. Each of these places is a strange piece in the official story, a fragment of our lost history that challenges what you learned at school about ancient civilizations and about the timeline of civilization itself. So get ready, because I'm Curious Chris. Come, join me, and let's explore. Ancient Jericho. When archaeologists began excavating Jericho in the 20th century, they expected to find ruins from biblical times, maybe some old houses, shards of pottery, and not much else. Instead, they discovered a layer cake with more than 20 levels of human occupation, going deeper and deeper in time until they reached a period when supposedly there were no cities at all. There, buried under meters of sediment, was a stone tower almost 9 meters high with an internal staircase and a wall of rough stones, all dated to a time when agriculture was still in its infancy and pottery was barely beginning to appear. According to the traditional narrative of ancient civilizations, this kind of ancient architecture should only appear thousands of years later, when kingdoms, armies, and states were already well established. But Jericho is there, solid, knocking down the straight line of history as if it were just another shattered myth of our ancient humanity. The official explanation tries to force Jericho into the standard model. Some researchers say the wall was just a retaining wall against floods, the result of empirical observation and a lot of manual labor, without the need for an advanced civilization. Others claim the tower functioned as an observation point, perhaps to keep watch over rival groups, pushing the idea of war and organized conflict thousands of years back into our prehistory. Most scholars insist, as impressive as they are, these structures do not require mysterious ancient technologies, only time, collective effort, and necessity. But even accepting every part of this view, an uncomfortable question keeps echoing. Why would such an ancient community, with so few people on the planet and so few resources, invest so much energy in raising stone walls and towers? If you follow the logic of lost history and forbidden archaeology, Jericho opens the door to other possibilities. Could this city be an echo of even older knowledge, inherited from earlier groups that already knew how to organize large building projects before written records existed? Could the tower also have symbolic, astronomical, or spiritual functions, perhaps aligned with the sun or the stars, hinting at a kind of ancient astronomy that doesn't appear in the books? And the human skulls covered in plaster, with mottled features and shell eyes buried beneath the houses. Were they just simple rituals or signs of a much more sophisticated relationship with memory, identity, and death in ancient societies? Jericho seems to tell us, in stone, you underestimated your ancestors. The greatest provocation of ancient Jericho is not just the wall or the tower, but what they reveal about us. We like to believe that intelligence, organization, and technical capacity emerged slowly, in a straight line, step by step. until they reached what we call civilization. But when a city with more than 11,000 years of continuous occupation appears with fortifications so early in the timeline of civilization, we are forced to ask, how many other stories like this have been erased, buried, or forgotten? How many other examples of ancient knowledge simply did not survive? If such an old people were capable of building monumental towers and walls, what else did they know about the human body, pain and healing that left no marks in stone? To find that answer, we need to leave the walls and go inside a tooth, to a place called Mehrgarh, where ancient medicine was much more frightening and much more advanced than you imagine. Mehrgarh. Imagine you have a toothache so strong you can hardly think. There is no medicine, no anesthesia, no dentist in a white coat. It's around 7000 BC, long before any medical school, long before many of the great ancient civilizations of the Middle East appear. You go to the healer in your village in Mehrgarh, in what is now Pakistan. He looks at your swollen face, picks up a stone tool tied to a wooden bow, and starts to spin. Slowly, with frightening precision, he drills into your live molar, opening a small cone in the tooth to relieve the infection. There is no anesthesia, only pain, skill, and courage. It sounds like a horror story, but it is reality. In Mehrgarh, 9,000 years ago, someone was already practicing a type of ancient medicine that should not exist so early in our timeline of civilization. When archaeologists began excavating Mehrgarh in the mid-20th century, they expected to find a simple Neolithic village. People learning to plant, domesticate animals, make pottery. Nothing too impressive. Instead, they found one of the first large settlements of our prehistory, with mud brick houses, granaries, signs of trade, and even early use of copper. But the real surprise only came in 2006, when researchers carefully analyzed the teeth of some human skeletons. In at least 11 molars from 9 different individuals, there were small, perfectly circular or conical holes, between 1 and 3 millimeters in diameter, drilled into teeth that were still in the mouth when the person was alive. These marks were not accidents or natural cracks. They were procedures. They were dental appointments in an ancient society that, according to official history, should not even know how to write its own name yet. The traditional explanation says that the inhabitants of Mehrgarh already mastered tools like the bow drill, used to pierce stone beads, and that at some point someone had the idea of applying this technique to teeth. Over time, the community would have learned, by trial and error, to relieve pain by drilling into decayed or infected teeth. There is no evidence of fillings, crowns, or metal, only the hole. Scientists argue that, even without understanding bacteria or anatomy, these people could observe that some patients improved and lived many years after the procedure. For the standard model of ancient societies, this is seen as an example of human creativity, but still framed within the narrative of slow progress, with nothing magical or lost ancient technologies. Just very determined people, a lot of pain, and a lot of experimentation. But if we look with the same critical eye that we use for other mysteries of forbidden archaeology, Mehrgarh starts to look like more than just trial and error. The perforations are surprisingly precise, with varied shapes, conical, cylindrical, trapezoidal, as if different techniques were being used for different problems. And most importantly, the analyses show that the patients survived for years after the procedure, which suggests not an isolated experiment, but a consolidated practice, repeated, taught, transmitted. Where did this knowledge begin? Over how many generations was it refined? Did these healers also use plants to relieve pain, hygiene techniques, or even rituals to calm fear? Aspects of ancient humanity that leave no fossils or ruins? And what if this is only the visible part of a much larger medical system that simply disappeared because it was never written down? Mehrgarh forces us to face an uncomfortable question about our lost history. Why is the intelligence of ancient peoples always treated as surprising, as if it were an exception, when everything we see points to humans just as observant and creative as we are? If a Neolithic community was capable of developing a functional kind of dentistry 9,000 years ago, how many other forms of ancient knowledge existed and vanished without leaving drilled bones to tell the story? And more. If in Mehrgarh someone already mastered the healing of pain, bone and tooth with such firmness, in what other ways did these primitive peoples look at the sky, the seasons, the movement of the sun and the stars? To answer that, we need to leave the inside of the human mouth and turn our eyes to the night horizon, to a circle of stones in the African desert, where nomadic herders, without writing and without cities, seem to have conversed with the cosmos. The enigmatic observatory of Nabta Playa. Close your eyes and erase from your mind the Sahara as you know it. Endless dunes, crushing heat, deadly silence. Go back to around 7,000 BC. We are before recorded history, at a time when this region was a green savanna, with seasonal lakes, low trees, and herds moving along the horizon. Now imagine small groups of nomadic herders setting up camp by a lake that fills and dries over the course of the year. They have no cities, no writing, no giant temples, nothing we associate with great ancient civilizations. And yet, instead of just getting on with life, they begin to raise stones, align blocks, mark directions. Slowly, lines of a stone calendar appear in the desert. This place exists. It is Nabta Playa, and it does not fit the straight, simple story we were told about the timeline of civilization. When archaeologists began studying Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, they realized that those stones were not scattered at random. There was a central stone circle and larger monoliths around it, as if someone had drawn a time-measuring machine on the ground. When they analyzed these orientations, researchers noticed that some stones mark sunrise on the summer solstice, the day when the sun reaches its highest point in the sky. Others seem to align with important stars, such as Sirius and Orion's belt, which would later be fundamental in the myths and temples of pharaonic Egypt. And all this was built about 2,000 years before the first pyramids, in the middle of prehistory, by peoples who, in the traditional narrative, would still be just herding cattle and trying to survive. The official explanation is simple and comforting. These herders needed to know when the rains would return, when the lakes would fill, when to move their herds, and using the sky as a calendar was the most logical solution. It would be enough to observe the sun and stars for many generations, choose fixed points, and use stones as markers. No lost civilization, no mysterious ancient technologies, just the normal intelligence of ancient humanity applied with patience. For many scholars, Nabta Playa is a perfect example of how ancient societies without writing, cities or kingdoms could develop sophisticated ancient knowledge without the need for kings, giant temples, or mystical theories. In other words, it is impressive, but it doesn't break the timeline. It just stretches it a bit. But if we apply the same critical gaze we use for other enigmas of forbidden archaeology, Nabta Playa starts to become unsettling. Some studies suggest that certain stones may represent stars in positions that point to epochs even older than the construction of the circle itself, as if this astronomical knowledge had been inherited from a long tradition, passed on through stories, songs, initiations. An oral astronomy, part of our lost history, which leaves no books, but leaves repeating patterns in the sky and in stone. How many generations does it take to turn casual observations into such a consistent system? How does a nomadic people, always on the move, maintain the same precision over centuries? And why choose precisely those stars, the same ones that would later be sacred to other cultures? Coincidence, or traces of a much older memory in our ancient humanity? What Nabta Playa forces us to face is the idea that science, religion, and survival may have walked together long before we imagine. Herders without writing, metal, or cities were already capable of looking at the sky and seeing in it a clock, a calendar, and perhaps a message. If we accept this, we also have to accept that other peoples considered simple, like hunter-gatherers without agriculture, might have been capable of equally enormous feats, not only with stones stuck in the ground, but with earth itself, shaping entire landscapes. And if, just like in Nabta Playa, we are underestimating what these people could build without what we call civilization? To test this idea, we are going to cross the ocean and reach Louisiana, where a people without farms raised gigantic earth mounds and circles using only baskets, hands, and a level of organization that should not exist at that time, the enigmatic complex of Poverty Point. Poverty Point. Imagine you are walking across a flat landscape in Louisiana, in the United States. No stone pyramids, no giant walls. At first sight, it looks like just an open field. Now, go up a few meters, or imagine you can see it all from above, like a bird or a drone. Suddenly, what looked flat reveals a gigantic drawing on the ground. 6 concentric arcs of earth, like waves spreading from a central point, all made by hand. In the middle, a large open space, and nearby, a bird-shaped mound of earth as tall as a multi-story building. We are about 3,700 years ago, in the heart of the prehistory of the Americas, in a place called Poverty Point. And all this was built by people who, according to the books, were still living by hunting and gathering, with no farms, no crops, no agriculture. This is another shock to our timeline of civilization. Archaeologists estimate that to create the mounds and circular ridges of Poverty Point, around 1 million cubic meters of soil were moved by hand. No trucks, no excavators, no wheels, no pack animals, just baskets, arms, and coordination. The crescent-shaped ridges, nearly a kilometer in diameter, seem to have served as foundations for houses, while the great bird-shaped mound, about 22 meters high, dominates the landscape. The most surprising detail? The diet of the people who lived there was based on fish, waterfowl, nuts, and wild animals. There is no solid evidence of agriculture. According to the traditional narrative, monumental works of this scale are exclusive to large agricultural ancient societies, with surplus food, rigid hierarchy, and chiefs giving orders. Poverty Point looked at this rule, smiled, and dumped dirt all over it. The official explanation tries to reconcile the impossible with the known. Scholars say the region was so rich in natural resources, rivers full of fish, flocks of migratory birds, forests with nuts, that these hunter-gatherers could afford to stay longer in the same place. With more food available, there was extra energy for larger collective projects. The works would have been built gradually over generations, as part of seasonal gatherings that brought together hundreds or thousands of people. No kings, no stone temples, just a large ceremonial and exchange center. That is still impressive, but it fits within a safer view of ancient humanity. Given good conditions, even groups without agriculture could build something big. A feat, yes, but without any need for lost ancient technologies or esoteric theories. However, when we place Poverty Point alongside other enigmas of forbidden archaeology, the explanation starts to sound incomplete. How can a people without farms, who need to hunt and gather every day to survive, plan and maintain a project that requires coordinated movement of so much earth over such a long time? What kind of leadership, organization, or cultural tradition is needed to get thousands of people to return to the same place, generation after generation, and keep building the same system of mounds and circles? And what does the exchange network, which brought stones and minerals from up to 1,000 kilometers away, reveal about the complexity of these ancient societies? If we call this a simple people, maybe the problem isn't with them, but with the way we underestimate the ancient knowledge of those who lived without bricks, metal, or writing. Poverty Point also forces us to revisit a very common idea, that agriculture is always the cause and monumental architecture is always the effect. Here, things seem to move side by side or even backwards. A people classified as hunter-gatherers reshapes an entire landscape with organized earthworks, on an almost urban scale, leaving no palaces, no stone temples, no walls, but making it clear they could coordinate themselves on a scale that rivals several agricultural ancient civilizations. If they were able to do this with earth, baskets, and distributed labor, what might other groups, in other parts of the world, have built with wood, mud, or materials that simply did not survive the passage of time? And if there are entire cities of simple peoples that vanish from the books because they don't fit the classic mold of civilization? When we look at Poverty Point from above, we see not only mounds and curves, but a giant question written in the ground. What really defines a civilization? Agriculture, writing, palaces and armies, or the ability to bring thousands of people together around a common project that lasts generations? If hunter-gatherers were able to create such a vast work, maybe we need to rethink everything we believe we know about how ancient civilizations and the first cities emerge. And that takes us to another place just as ancient and intriguing, where thousands of people lived pressed up against one another with no streets, no front doors, no palaces, and no obvious signs of rulers. The compact, enigmatic city of Çatalhöyük in Turkey. Çatalhöyük. Close your eyes and imagine you're entering a city of about 10,000 people. You expect to see streets, squares, doors, maybe a palace in the center, or a temple dominating the skyline. Now, open your eyes in 7,500 BC, before recorded history, in what is now central Turkey. You are in Çatalhöyük. But here, there are no streets. There are no doors in the facades. The houses are glued to each other like cells in a honeycomb. To get in, you climb a ladder up to the roof, walk across the rooftops of neighboring houses, and go down through an opening in the ceiling. Inside, the floor hides something stranger still. Beneath you, dozens of ancestral bodies are buried under the floor. And despite all this density, there are no palaces, no monumental temples, no thrones or obvious fortresses. It is a huge city in our timeline of civilization, but one that seems to have forgotten to invent rulers. When archaeologists began excavating Çatalhöyük in the 1960s, and later, even more intensively, in the 1990s, they expected to find the classic hallmarks of one of the first great ancient civilizations: larger elite houses, special buildings for chiefs or priests, perhaps walls, perhaps many weapons. Instead, they found a sea of very similar houses, packed side by side, with similar size, similar organization, and decoration scattered among many homes, not concentrated in a single central temple. Wall paintings, remains of sculptures, bullhorns and skulls decorating interiors, religious or symbolic elements, but distributed relatively evenly. No building stands out clearly as the king's house or the main god's temple. For a settlement that lasted almost 2,000 years, this does not fit well at all with the traditional model of ancient societies. The dominant explanation tries to place Çatalhöyük as a sort of early experiment in urban living, a stage before the emergence of hierarchical cities we know better. According to many specialists, the fact that the houses are similar and there are no clearly administrative buildings suggests a more egalitarian society with distributed power, perhaps based on families and ancestors rather than kings and armies. They argue that, with resources still relatively abundant and a population that, though large, was not huge, the community could resolve conflicts through kinship networks, rituals, and customs without needing a dominant class carved in stone. In this scenario, Çatalhöyük would be less an anomaly and more a trial run of urbanism in ancient humanity, before inequality and rigid power structures took over later cities. But if we look at Çatalhöyük with the same lens we use for other enigmas of forbidden archaeology, what emerges is even more provocative. How can a city that housed thousands of people in tightly packed houses function for almost 2,000 years without leaving clear traces of a central government, barracks, prisons, or walls? What kind of social technology did these people develop to deal with fights, disputes, and major decisions without needing thrones or castles? And furthermore, if religious symbols and art are spread across many homes instead of being concentrated in giant temples, doesn't that suggest a spirituality that is much more distributed, present in everyday life, rather than controlled by a priestly elite? In terms of ancient knowledge about human coexistence, Çatalhöyük may be as advanced as any later empire, just without uniforms, crowns, or monuments of power. The most uncomfortable part is that Çatalhöyük forces us to ask a question that almost never appears in school textbooks. Are rigid hierarchy, kings and armies really inevitable in large cities, or are they a historical choice that ended up winning out over other options? If a community thousands of years before recorded history managed to sustain dense urban life with art, rituals, agriculture, and trade without leaving clear signs of rulers, that means we had different paths for organizing ancient humanity, and some of them were simply forgotten or replaced. And if some of these experiments in cities without kings, as well as other experiences of cities without war, proved that another kind of urban life was possible, and we just let that memory slip away into the dust of lost history? To investigate this other extreme, we have to cross the ocean again and go down into a valley in Peru, where a civilization raised pyramids and entire cities for more than a millennium, almost without leaving traces of weapons or battles. The enigmatic Caral-Supe. Caral-Supe. Close your eyes. Now, instead of pyramids in Egypt or ziggurats in Mesopotamia, imagine a coastal valley in Peru around 5,000 years ago. The wind from the Pacific Ocean, the sound of a river cutting through the desert, the smell of dry earth and campfires during the day. You are in a world before recorded history in the Americas, long before the Incas, long before any empire you have heard of. In front of you there isn't a single isolated village, but a complex of earth and stone pyramids, sunken plazas, and monumental platforms. This place is called Caral-Supe, and it is as old as the first great cities of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The difference? Here, in one of the oldest ancient civilizations of the Americas, something seems to be missing. Weapons, walls, fortifications. On a planet where history is almost always told as the history of wars, Caral-Supe appears as a strange silence in our timeline of civilization. When archaeologist Ruth Shady began excavating Caral-Supe in the 1990s, many people thought those structures in the Peruvian desert were relatively recent, maybe just a few centuries old. But the dates started coming back, and they went far, around 3000 BC, a time when most history books are busy talking about pharaohs and Mesopotamian cities. There were 6 large pyramids, the biggest of them about 60 meters high in its time. Sunken circular plazas, platforms, residential complexes, and evidence of a network of more than 30 settlements spread across the valley. That's civilization by any definition. Monumental architecture, organized labor, long-distance trade, a complex society. For traditional models of ancient societies, only one piece was missing to complete the package: evidence of war. But it simply did not appear. In Caral-Supe, there are no defensive walls, no layers of ash marking cities burned in battles, no mass burials of warriors with weapons, no icons glorifying soldiers. Instead, what archaeologists find are musical instruments, bone flutes and trumpets made from shells, remains of fishing nets, irrigation channels, observation platforms, and evidence of an economy based on exchanges. Cotton coming from inland to make nets. Fish coming from the coast to feed those who lived in the valleys. Many specialists suggest that here, a relative abundance of resources helped to avoid armed conflict, and that cooperation between communities was more advantageous than open war. For the official narrative, Caral-Supe becomes a rare but possible example of an ancient civilization that grew without needing to put violence at the center of its identity. But if we look at Caral-Supe with the same critical gaze we use for other cases of forbidden archaeology, things get even more intriguing. A civilization that raises pyramids, coordinates thousands of people in multi-generational projects, controls irrigation in a desert, and maintains extensive trade networks, does all this for more than 1,000 years and still leaves so few signs of organized conflict? Are we only seeing what is left? And were the weapons made of perishable materials like wood? Or are we looking at an ancient civilization that found ways to resolve disputes without turning war into its primary driving force? And what if part of the secret of its stability lay precisely in its cultural, musical, and spiritual practices? In those instruments, rituals, and communal spaces that we don't usually take as seriously as swords, spears, and stone walls? Caral-Supe raises a direct question about our ancient knowledge of how societies work. How many times have we heard that great cities require authoritarian rulers, permanent armies, and institutionalized violence to keep everything under control? And yet, here is one of the oldest cities on the American continent, seemingly having followed another path for more than a millennium. When we put Caral-Supe together with Çatalhöyük, Poverty Point, Nabta Playa, Mehrgarh, and ancient Jericho, a strange pattern starts to appear. Cities without obvious kings, civilizations without clear evidence of war, astronomy before empires, medicine before libraries, monumental works before what we call the state. Instead of just reinforcing what we already believe, these places suggest that our view of the timeline of civilization may be incomplete, and that much of our lost history is made up precisely of experiences that worked for centuries but were erased because they did not fit the story of empires, wars, and conquests we are used to telling. These places are not legends, not myths. They are ruins you can visit and explore, data you can read, evidence that challenges the idea that our ancestors were simple, foolish, and that progress was always slow, uniform, and inevitable. If you made it this far, you are part of that small group of explorers who are not satisfied with ready-made answers. So tell me, which of these ancient civilizations did you already know? Write in the comments what surprised you the most and what other forbidden history or alternative history topic you want to see here. And of course, if these lost civilizations gave you that feeling of opening a secret passageway in the middle of history, don't stop here. Leave your like, share this video with more explorers, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you can keep coming with me into these dark tunnels of forbidden history full of unanswered questions. I'm Curious Chris, and I want you with me on the next discoveries. See you next time.